Deep Woods Encounter Stories. It was not a dog. It was late summer at night, and I was on the east side of the city. Well, actually pretty far outside of the city, kind of out tucked out in the boondocks, if you catch my drift. Walking along a long dirt road that led all the way back to my house from swimming at the river all day with a friend of mine. Well, I normally wouldn't have been out this late at night, but I kind of got carried away at the river. You know, being 14 and having far too much fun. All along this dirt road, there are a few houses, seldom spread out, and this really rinky-dink chain link fence. It's pretty rusty, on the verge of falling apart. This is off to my left as I'm walking this long dirt road back up to my house, which is maybe 3+ miles at most. As I stated, there are several houses off to my left, but pretty far and few in between, over the course of the entirety of this dirt road. All around me are just woods. Not many people at all. As I said, I'm kind of tucked out in the boondocks. Only few people live out here. I've walked this road several times in the early morning and at night, with no problems. This was the first and only night I ever had any issue, so to speak. So, as I'm walking down this road, I start to hear something off to the left, and I see something ahead of me jump out from the fence and lands on the road. It looked large. I assumed maybe it was a deer in just the second it happened, but I could see it was something else. The second my eyes realized this was not a deer, my entire body reacted. I just knew in my gut instinct this was something else entirely. Something evil. It was the shape of a dog, but it wasn't a dog. It was huge, much larger, and as soon as it made contact with the ground, it stood up on 2 legs, exposing very long front legs, very long, thin arms, and bright yellow eyes. That's just when I saw how large its hands were, or paws, whatever you want to call them. They had very long, extendable claws. It took 3 steps, looked back over at me, and disappeared on the other side of the road. I was practically terrified. I took that opportunity to run all the way back home. I never told anybody about it, until now. One other thing I want to mention is just how bad the odor was. Right before it appeared, I remember getting this hint of odor in the air. It was kind of like a dead animal, but there was something else there, like another odor undertone. Maybe like, I don't know, wet dog or something. It was a musty odor, paired with the rotting meat smell. And maybe not even a few seconds later, after my nose first caught whiff, is when I see this thing clamber over the fence onto the dirt road, quickly glance over at me, and then vanish on the other side of the road into the woods. I'm not sure why it didn't do anything. Maybe I caught it going from point A to point B, but I'm not sure. Anyway, I ran home, had no problems, didn't say anything to nobody about it because what am I supposed to say? Like what? That I saw a werewolf or something? I mean, really. In fact, I even had my doubts about sending this email. I know you do all sorts of stories like this, but come on. Reality is reality. But before I decided to write this up, I've been thinking about it a lot lately. You know, with everybody having so much time off in the last year. So, after doing some looking up and research, I guess what I saw could be a dogman. At least all the boxes are checked, unless it was something else entirely. But this thing wasn't any more than, I don't know, 20-30 feet away from me, and I smelt it. I think that's what disturbs me the most about that night. This was also back in 2012, summer of 2012. And regardless of what I saw or what I experienced, I can confidently say I will never forget that night, no matter who believes me or does not believe me. Necromechanical. Okay, so this happened just a few years back. It was either 2016 or 2017. Anyway, not too far from my house, tucked away in the woods, is this small little cemetery. It's kind of an unmarked private cemetery, maybe no more than 40-50 graves at most, full of older settlers who were first came to this town, and even kind of has an off subsection for their pets as well, of course with not as nice gravestones. And as you can imagine, with this type of private tucked away cemetery, it's very much sort of forgotten about, very old and very overgrown. Any fencing or protective barrier this place once ever had is now pretty much dilapidated, falling apart, or just plain overtaken by nature. It's not completely off the beaten path though, as one might expect from a description like I just gave. You go about maybe a mile or two back on this path, and after turning a sharp left, it will take you right to this little cemetery. Now, I first learned about this place back when I was in high school. Sometimes we would come out here, pretend to be spooky and do an EVP session, or, smoke weed, smoke cigarettes, drink, party, typical things that juniors and seniors do in high school. And believe me, I did all the above. But that's not what today's story is about. See, even after high school, there's just something different about this particular cemetery. I don't know what it is. It's not like other cemeteries. No, I'm not talking about zombies or anything like that. There's just an energy that I can't quite explain. The air just feels different here. I don't know. On one end, it's extremely peaceful, but on the other end, it's like no animals or sounds come here, if that makes any sense at all. I don't know. I just, in a way, feel drawn to this place. And so often, I'll take hikes and come here to the cemetery and just hang out, read the old etched-away gravestones, and just try to collect the thoughts in my head, the same way you would if you were to take a shower. Okay, enough irrelevant back information. So, just a few years ago, and by the way, this is pretty much the reason why I stopped coming here. Whatever I heard this day really kind of freaked me out, and there should be no reason why I heard the sound that I did. So, just like any other day, I came here, nothing out of the ordinary, nobody else around, no reason for anybody else being around. I'm by myself, and I'm sitting on this one gravestone, just kind of minding my own business, really enjoying how silent it is all around me. Oh, quick note. The entirety of this cemetery, like I said, is pretty overgrown, but the woods around it are pretty thick. So, unless you're looking out the front gate, you can't really see anything else around you. And this is easily maybe a mile or two away from any civilization. At least any development, I should say. So, where was I? I was sitting on this stone, and I start to hear this humming noise. Except it's coming from underneath me. And it's loud. Like, really loud. And it's not just directly beneath me, but all over the ground underneath. It sounded like some big mechanical machine or some sort of device, and it was making this really loud hum. I have no idea what it was, but as soon as I heard it, maybe not even 10 seconds later, I get this really bad feeling come over me, and I've never had this happen before. It was this feeling like, I need to get out of there now. I need to leave. I'm in total danger. Well, I trust my gut instinct, and I ran hard, and I ran fast. I did not look back. I booked it out of there. That was only one day, and I've tried coming back in the time since, but to be honest with you, I just feel like there's something in the pit of my stomach that tells me I should avoid this place at all costs. Oh, and before I end this email, it's also important to note that, no, There was no excavation going on, no mechanical equipment, no construction nearby, nothing. No drilling. There would be no reason for any of this to happen, since the adjacent area is all nature trails. The closest development would be a neighborhood roughly 2 miles away, which is now about 10 years old. Other than that, there is no new construction or anything. Because trust me, I've tried my hardest to rationalize what I've heard, and I can't come to a single conclusion. Just outside my house. Not too long ago, I was hearing something strange just outside my house. See, I kind of live in a simple 3-2, out not exactly in the middle of nowhere, but I had a lot of pine and fir trees on the far side of my flat property. Basically, once you exit my house, it's just flat cut-down field and then thick tree line from the north, east, and west. Then on the south side runs a long gravel road that leads to another, less busier road that takes you closer to town. Most nights are fine, and like everybody else, we get the occasional opossum, raccoon, and whatever other night critters lurk around in search of food, scraps, or whatever it is they can find, but it's usually food. These to me don't really present any problems, as I'm pretty well used to them, and, for the most part, simply ignore them. Yeah, I'm bad sometimes and leave out cat food for the raccoons, but I'm telling you now, what I heard was no raccoon. Alright, so let's set up the time and place. I was getting ready to go outside about 1:30 in the morning to go and have a cigarette, and I hear this strange clicking noise. And it almost reminded me of the clicking noises you would hear from creatures in a movie. I can't think of any pinpoint specific movie off the top of my head, but that's where my mind immediately went to. And my first thought is, did I leave something on? Is there something maybe playing on my phone? But after checking and nothing being there, I was just kind of like, huh. And as I listened closer and closer, I could hear this clicking noise randomly coming from outside, and it sounded like it was getting closer to my house. So, call me stupid, or maybe just very curious, dangerously curious. I stepped outside my porch, looked around in the darkness, but couldn't see anything. But I could hear something walking around, making that same strange noise, and it began to make its way towards the back end of my house. After I heard it, whatever it was walking around, that's when I began to get extremely uncomfortable, because I just had this feeling deep down that I was not alone. I said screw it to the cigarettes, walked back inside, locked the door, closed the curtains, walked around and made sure every door and window was tightly and securely locked and every blind was closed. I didn't want anyone or anything giving me the chance to look in. I didn't want to risk seeing a face that would leave me nightmares. And as you can imagine, at this point, I'm near full-blown panic meltdown, now that I know for a fact someone or something is outside. But my brain didn't quite go to the something route yet, like some weird creature or something. I thought it was potentially some axe-wielding murderer trying to break into my house. That was until this next part. As I hear whatever it is now get right up against my house, and it sounds much larger than a person, just from the way it walked to the sounds that it made, and it scraped something really heavy against the side of the house. I could hear it as it slowly walked all the way around the back, then to the side of the house on the east, dragging something large and heavy and sharp against the side of the house, all while making this weird clicking noise. Then, it just stopped. I sat there waiting in silence for this to resume, or maybe it was trying to wait me out, maybe trying to extract me out of the house to see if I would be curious enough to see if this was gone. No. I was not going to buy into its games, or his or her games. whatever this thing was. So I sat there, waiting. Maybe, I don't know, 20 minutes went by, I think, and I checked my phone. Now it was closer to 2:15. I decided now might be the best time to go out and see if there's anyone or anything out there. I had not heard anything in quite a while, and upon stepping upon my back porch, did not provide me any relief. Not only could I not really see anything, I mean, it is nighttime, it's pitch black outside, there are virtually no lights other than my dainty little porch light, and to accompany all these things, there were two additional details that really just stirs the pot. The first being is upon exiting the house and stepping out onto the back porch, I noticed almost instantaneously how quiet the night was. No crickets, nothing. It was dead silent outside. When before, as I stepped out to do my cigarette around 1:30, there were crickets and it was quite loud. Now, the night was completely quiet. The second thing is that I felt like something was watching me, just off in the darkness, not too far away but close by. Something was keeping track of me, watching my every movement. Tell me, have you ever had that feeling that somebody was watching you? You don't even have to think about it, or really entertain the idea. It's just this innate feeling you get. Well, that's exactly what happened to me. I didn't waste much more time. I went back inside, locked the sliding glass door, closed the blinds again, and that was it. I was done till morning. I decided it was just best to go to bed. So I went to bed, lied there awake, the night still quiet outside, expecting to hear this thing come back, expecting to hear that same clicking noise, and that large heavy object, whatever it was, being dragged across the side of the house. Whatever that was, I'm not sure. I somehow fell asleep, but not for a few hours later. I woke up in the morning, got my cup of coffee, and rushed outside. Although I didn't see anything like blood, bones, or any dead bodies, I did see this odd scratch mark all along the back side of my house and to the east side of the house. It's maybe about 4.5 to 5 feet up on the wall. I can't tell what it is. It looked like somebody dragged something along the house, but like I said, there's no telling what it could be. I also searched the ground below me, no tracks, no hair, nothing. And there's also no sign of where this person or thing went off to. The other thing is, too, it must have just been some sort of fluke, maybe some freak incident, because this is the one and only night that I've ever experienced such a terrifying thing out here in the middle of nowhere. The figure. Okay, this is my own terrifying camping story. One time, I was going on a 3-day camping solo hiking trip, whatever you want to call it, all by myself, not really up in the mountains, more like the foothills. And safe to say, things were going great. I left Friday morning and had all the plans to return Sunday evening. Friday went swell, went to bed, woke up just fine. Saturday, again, went fantastic. Had a great time, had a nice big fire, a great dinner. Me being me, I drink a ton of water, so that generally means I have to pee a lot. Well, this night was no different. So I go to bed and I crash out. It's probably maybe 9 p.m. I awake sometime in the middle of the night, maybe closer to midnight, 1 in the morning. I'm not too sure. Judging by the position of the moon in the sky, I would probably guess closer to midnight. Anyway, I get out of my tent, half groggy, still kind of asleep, wander over to the nearest tree to relieve myself and do my duty. As I'm about midstream, in my sleepless daze, I kind of look up and see something terrifying. Maybe a few trees down are these 2 white fiery orbs. At first, I'm like, what? Are those lights? And then, as I'm staring at them for longer, I realize those are not lights. They're eyes. Eyes of some kind of animal. Now, I want you to picture something for a moment. Have you ever driven at night and your headlights illuminated the eyes of a deer? You know how their eyes are kind of just like these fiery orbs of light? That's almost exactly what I was looking at, except these were glowing, and it was pitch black in the middle of the forest. And here I am, shirt, boxers, my schlong is hanging out, and I'm about midstream, and I see these two pair of eyes slowly start to waddle towards me. And whatever they were attached to seemed pretty tall, because I was looking up at the eyes near a very tall tree in the distance. I quickly cut off my stream, pulled up my boxers, and ran back into my tent, zipped it up, jumped in my sleeping bag, and hid like a coward for the remainder of, I couldn't even tell you how many hours, because honestly, I lost track of time. I want to say I slept at some point, but I can't really remember if I did. But I do remember at some point getting out of my sleeping bag, opening my tent, and it being morning time. I didn't waste any time. I was still pumped so full of adrenaline. I quickly took all my tent down, got all my camping supplies, and I moved out of that area very quickly. I didn't want to know what, who, when, why, or any of those details at all. I didn't care. That was terrifying enough. But I have gone camping around the same area since this has happened, and that was the only time ever in my life I've ever encountered anything I can't quite explain. Trying to break in. So, quick story about me. I've lived all up and down the Oregon coast. Primarily in my early 20s, I lived right around Tillamook, Oregon. For those that don't know, Tillamook, Oregon is probably one of the most booming places near the coast. It's not a coast town, but it's very close. We have a massive cheese factory here that houses the infamous Tillamook brand. Anyway, I was also only 23 at the time of this story. So, during this time, I lived just inside Tillamook. Well, more like just outside of Tillamook. And my girlfriend lived closer to Portland, Oregon, which is like an hour plus a drive. So, I was going to go pick her up this night. It was a Friday night, and I had just gotten off work. It was maybe 9:20, 9:30, and I was headed eastbound on Highway 131. If you know anything about this road, or are maybe a local, or have been to Tillamook, you would know that this road is pretty full of forest on both sides. At least the left side is. The right is thick with brush, and then forest beyond that. There are very few pull-out spots, and of course, lucky me, I had terrible cell service, and she kept trying to call me. My girlfriend knows not to try and call me when I'm driving. I'm a pretty safe driver, and I don't like taking phone calls or text. I like to be safe. So, what did good boyfriend me try to do? Find the nearest pull-out spot, call her back, and find out what's going on. Well, turns out there was an actual issue, but I'm not going to get to that just yet. And it's really not really important to the story. So, I found the nearest pull-out spot. And keep in mind, it's, like I said, roughly 9:30 at night. There's not a whole lot of other cars out on the road. Pretty much just me and a few other cars. So, I turn into this pull-out spot, pull up my flip phone, and I'm trying to call her back, but my service is very spotty. This was also back in 2009, just before the peak of smartphones and all that. And no, I did not have the new fancy schmancy iPhone just yet. Still dealing with the Nokia flip phone at the time. And as I'm trying to call her back, over and over, and I'm getting only partial rings because it's cutting out, I kind of see something off to my right. I turn my head, and I see this large arm reach out to my passenger side door and yanking on it really hard. I drop my phone and start yelling in fear. And I see whatever this is bend down and press its face up against my passenger side window. I say it because I don't know what this thing was, but it was ugly. It looked like a flipping goblin or something. I don't know. It was pretty ugly. Covered in long, shaggy hair, too. And it kept trying to yank my passenger door handle open. Very hard, too. Shaking the entire car. And believe me, I was driving a 2002 Ford Focus. Nothing fancy at all at the time. I believe if this thing wanted to, it could have ripped my entire passenger door off the car. It was huge. And even though it was nighttime, there was just enough light outside that I can generally see what it was that was trying to break into my car. After maybe this thing was trying for, I don't know, time seemed to slow down. And while in my head, rethinking the events, it felt like minutes. It was probably no more than 10 seconds. I brought my attention back to the car, flung it in a drive. Didn't even care if there was a vehicle oncoming behind me. Didn't even turn my blinker on. I just ripped out into the lane and flew off, hoping that whatever this creature or person or being was not going to try and follow me. At least I hoped. I was definitely going well over the speed limit, flying on the road. That's when I got to a spot where my girlfriend was calling, and her call cut through. I picked up and started freaking out, telling her what had happened. She was pretty worried about me, and we ended up talking about the issue at hand, which is why she was originally calling. But anyway, she believes that what tried to get into my car is a Bigfoot. But, even though I've lived on the coast and in Tillamook for a good amount of years, I've never believed in the whole Bigfoot thing. Plus, I have looked some pictures online, even watched the Patterson film. What I saw does not look like a Bigfoot. It was way uglier, and I'm pretty sure I feel like I'm using the right terminology when I say its face looked like that of an ugly goblin. Although the body was very big and hairy. I have no idea what it was, but I think what scares me is the fact that it snuck up to my car through the brush and trees without me even seeing it, and it knew how to flipping open a door because it was trying so hard. Had I left my passenger door open and unlocked, God only knows what it would have done when it got in my car. I shudder just thinking about that. Standing in the woods. It was the first time I'd ever seen one of these creatures. And what one of these creatures were, I don't know. But I know that I will never forget it. Me and my cousins were having a campfire in the middle of our yard, surrounded by thick woods. Actually, we're kind of backed right up against a national forest. Yeah, we live pretty out there. So, we're just telling stories and talking when my eyes caught movement just out in the trees. At first, I assumed maybe, oh, I see. One of my cousins brought his friends over to try and play some sort of clever trick. But the movements were all wrong. They were not like that of a person. They were really jittery and awkward and broken, if that makes any sense. So I started telling my cousin, and of course he laughed it off. Yeah, your eyes are probably just playing tricks on you, and that it was just my imagination. So as soon as he finished that, he went inside to go get something I don't remember. And that's when I became more focused on the woods. And that's when I could see this shape moving more and more. It looked to be some sort of humanoid creature, from what I could tell. It was like a man, but it wasn't a man. It appeared to have horns or something protruding from the top of its head, and its back was kind of hunched over. It was only about 30 feet away, kind of moving in and out between the trees, hiding behind to conceal itself. Now, since I was out here all alone, I was beginning to get really freaked out. My cousin comes back, and I just tell him, as serious as I can, we need to leave. So he's like, all right. We start walking towards the car, and I look back. This thing was following us, staying parallel in the woodline, watching us. I told my cousin I saw it, and that we should go inside, instead of trying to leave. Who knows what this thing's going to do? My cousin understood. He could tell how scared I was and knew I wasn't just making stuff up. Well, turns out that he would see it too. A couple of days after the sighting, and I'm still hanging out at my cousin's house, he tells me that he had seen it later on that night. Anyway, a couple of days later, I ended up telling my father what my cousin and I both saw, and he said it might have been a goat man. A goat man? I remember asking. He says yes, there have been reports and sightings of this thing before. It's pretty common folklore for the area. And as a matter of fact, there have even been people whose lives have been taken, or they've been driven to suicide by this supposed cryptid. My dad says him and his friends heard all sorts of stories from this thing growing up. And even my father himself swears at one point, when he too was a teenager, he saw something that was akin to the goat man in the woods, but says he can't be too sure. This is up in Michigan, by the way, just in case you were wondering. So, I don't know for sure if this was the goat man, or maybe a dog man, or what, but I can tell you for certain that it was not a person playing a prank. There was just something so wrong about this whole thing. The man and the body. I'll never forget that one evening, my girlfriend and I were out on a stroll, as we usually did. We loved to hike this 4-mile loop right around where we lived. One evening, as we're doing our usual stroll around this loop, we come to a section in the trail where it kind of opens up. At least the woods around us do. And just beyond to our right is a rather small river that probably could constitute as a creek. But the water is still flowing pretty fast, and it's deep enough that it's probably not exactly safe to stick your feet into. I don't know. Maybe it is fine. As my girlfriend and I were coming around this section of the trail, we see this dirty old man kind of hunched over by the open area of the trees, close by the river, and he was digging with a shovel, digging a deep hole. But what was more disturbing was as we stopped, my girlfriend actually stopped me and pointed. He was no more than 60-70 feet away from us, and he was full on maybe about 3 feet deep in this hole. But what really creeped us out was what was right on the ground next to the hole he was digging. It was just like in the movies. Something in a weird ball shape, what I take it now as somebody who was probably crouched in the fetal position or folded up, and looked to be in a large cheap sheet or blanket that had bloodstains, dried bloodstains all over it, just lying there on the ground. It wasn't stretched out like a body was. Like I said, if I had to guess, somebody was dead under that blanket, folded up in the fetal position. And this old man paid no attention to us. My girlfriend and I were like, oh my gosh, do you see that? Is that a body? Did he kill somebody and he's burying it out here? And we're talking amongst ourselves, trying to process, there's no way this is real. I mean, it's not like he's hidden. He's kind of out in the open. Anybody else walking on this trail could clearly see him burying this body. So we're talking, and we're like, all right, we need to go ask him a question, just to make sure this isn't truly what he's doing. And before we do that, the man angrily turns around, and his face is horribly disfigured. It looked like somebody grabbed this guy and put his face in a fire. It was nasty. He comes screaming at us and running with a shovel, muttering and screaming, I don't even know. It wasn't English. I don't even think it was any decipherable language. Phonetically, it did not sound like anything I've ever heard. My girlfriend and I don't waste any more time. We take off running, and we finish the extra 1.5 miles of the trail loop. This guy must have stopped somewhere back, but he did chase us quite a ways and almost caught up to us. Once we get out of the trailhead, we both pull out our phones and call 911 and report that some sicko is back here on this trail loop, bearing a dead body, and that he most likely murdered them. Well, just as cops would, they take this inquiry very seriously, and they show up within 7 minutes, asking my boyfriend and I several questions and multiple officers going back on the trail. Well, come to find out, when they get back there, the old man and the body in the sheet are gone. No trace of them. But the hole he just left seems to us that he dug about a 3-foot deep hole and about 5 foot wide. He even took a shovel. Police took our statements, took our names, all that, and they hung around for a while in case he came back. Even patrolled around a little bit, but this old sicko never came back. To this day, this was easily one of my creepiest deep woods stories that I have to tell people. I guess you could even say it's kind of a let's not meet, if you want to go that far. Whichever way you look at it, I hope I never run into that sicko again. The hanging head. Just to start my story off, there's nothing in this story that involves me seeing a Bigfoot or any sort of scary creatures. But my only findings were extremely disturbing, and I can't help but ask why. Alright, so now some background. I'm 32, and I've spent a lot of my time out in the woods, hiking, exploring nature, learning everything I can, and I'm obsessed with survival. So much so that I love to go out for days on end, with nothing but minimal supplies, to test my wits, my ability, my psyche. How much can I endure? Not in a sick, sadistic way, but when you're put into those situations, it really forces you to strategize and opens up a new compartment of your brain that's all about survival. Because if you don't, you die. Growing up, I've been very fortunate to have family that are very well versed in the woods. Trapping, hunting, tracking, exploring, surviving, you name it. So these little stints out in the woods for me is not really a huge deal. I know how to make makeshift traps and how to set all that stuff up. How to make fires and survive with the bare minimal necessities. I just do it because I enjoy it. So, that's a little bit about me. And this particular time is the only time where I broke my compass, and I actually ended up losing my way, which took me about 11 miles off route, which cost me a couple extra days. I had basically planned a 7-mile hike from point A to point B all the way through this national forest. About halfway through, I don't know how, but it taught me to always bring backup equipment. My compass broke, and I somehow was completely thrown off trail. How? I don't know. But I ended up taking the really long way, which instead of walking an additional 4 miles, it cost me an extra 11 miles, going all the way around. Now, this extra 11 miles, like I told you, cost me an extra 2 or 3 days, and I would go through more rugged backcountry. Definitely more unexplored territory, judging by the thickness of brush and the lack of any human souls around, or seeing as how anyone has ever even been out there. And this is what makes my findings so disturbing. I can't tell you which day because during my trek, all my adventuring kind of bled together, but it was somewhere here in the backcountry. There was this small clearing where there were no trees around, but this one fir tree right in the middle of this clearing. I would estimate maybe 120 yards all around, no trees, just kind of dead grass, and this dying fir tree. This fir tree, on one of its main branches, had this rope that looked to be quite new, and hanging on this rope, maybe about 20 feet, down to about ground level, I'd say maybe no more than 7-8 feet off the ground, that's what I interpret as ground level, was a severed, rotting head. A human head. I inspected it, just out of curiosity and awe, and it being so grotesque. It was real. but there's a few things about it that don't really make sense to me. Let me name them for you. First and foremost, this head. It appeared to be from a male, maybe in his later 40s or 50s, judging by how old he was. He had a very disgusted, contorted look on his face. The man obviously suffered before he was killed. His head, though, wasn't chopped off cleanly, nor cut off. Judging by the flesh, it appeared to have been ripped off his body, as if something grabbed his head and pulled it off his torso. The other disturbing thing is there were no flies, no maggots, and the most strange of all, no blood. He had little bits of dried blood around his mouth, and little bits around the wound, where you could tell the flesh was torn. But on the ground, nothing. And again, no flies or maggots. The smell was horrendous. If you've ever smelt rotting flesh, well, there you go. And this wasn't some old mummified head that had been sitting in the sun for weeks upon weeks. This head looked pretty fresh. Maybe no more than 3 days. I'm no mortician or coroner, but that's my best guess. And it was hanging by the neck from this rope, which also looked pretty new. To say I was not only creeped out but terrified was a huge understatement. I was frantically looking around, but you're out here in the middle of nowhere, miles away from any road, any civilization, development, town, city. Nothing. Who would come out here and put a human head out here? And more importantly, where did this head come from? Whose body did it belong to? Why did it stink like rot? But yet there were no flies. Why was there no blood? Who tore this man's head off his body? So many questions. And why this tree? In the middle of nowhere? Was this some sort of satanic ritual? None of it made sense. After seeing all I needed to see, I made it a lesson to get out of there as fast as I could and continue on my way to my trail, back where I needed to go. Eventually, as the days wore on, and I made it back to where I was supposed to be, to the end of the trail, I never really thought to call the police. I mean, I just thought, it's at least 7-8 miles back out in the backcountry. There's no way they're going to be able to get out there. This was back in 2011, so that's about 10 years now. Who knows if that head's still there? It might be. But I still wonder to this day, who and what? Why was that head out there? Who did it? And who's that poor soul that head belonged to? Alien objects. Okay, I have a very, very crazy story for you. I've actually been trying to compartmentalize this story for a long time. This was back when I was 15. I'm now 38 years old. At the time, I was fortunate enough to go camping with my crush. We were actually good friends, and she knew I had a major crush on her. And we would end up dating a few years after this event, and shortly break up afterwards. Then we kind of lost friendship. This mini camping trip, not only with my crush, but also occurred with my dad and my brother. So, my dad was actually the one who encouraged me to invite this girl, since we were kind of family friends, at least for a while. My dad, being my dad, drove us out to this rather cool campground that was fortunately not too populated, which meant more space for us to roam around and be 15-year-old kids. There was this beautiful lake right around it that we decided on day one we were going to do some hardcore swimming. It had been really hot lately, and I had really missed jumping in a huge body of water to cool off. I was a pretty good swimmer, and I wasn't scared of lakes or anything like that. Not like my older brother was, who had a terrifying fear of drowning, so he wouldn't really go near a lake. His game plan from the get-go was to get some good fishing in, so I was like, you know what, man, more power to ya. Go do it. My dad had the same plan. Him and my brother were going to sit back, catch some trout, while me and my wannabe girlfriend were going to go jump in the lake and cool off. So we went swimming, and we had a blast for hours. We actually moved through portions of the lake, starting closer to my brother and my father fishing, and moving our way closer over to the other side of the lake, challenging each other, who can swim farther, who can dive deeper. Looking back, we were really fearless and stupid. And I'll never forget, as we got closer to the other side of the lake, this side that did not really have any campground against it, and was just forest and shoreline. This girl, I won't name her name, the one who I had a major crush on, did a deep dive to see if she can go as deep as she could, which she was convinced was 20 feet. And she immediately comes up the lake, screaming, flipping out. I asked her what was wrong, joking, had she seen a lake monster? And she was convinced something was down there, and it touched her. I was kind of nervously laughing, still mocking her, thinking, what do you mean something touched you? There's nothing down here, it was probably just a fish. She started very quickly to outpace me, swimming to the shoreline to get out of the lake. I'm sitting there thinking, what gives? Why is she so freaked out? My dad and brother are on the opposite shore, kind of just shaking their heads and shaking their arms like, what happened? She must have just took a bad joke. So, being me, I follow after her and try to comfort her when I get to shore. She was freaked out and adamant that it wasn't a fish, that it was something large and fleshy, is the word she described it. We sat there talking. I put my arm around her, trying to be a good dude, just to comfort her and let her know that, hey, I really am boyfriend material. And I don't think it was maybe more than 15 minutes of this conversation happening when we both looked up and saw something floating along the water. From where we were at, we could not really tell what it was. So, eventually, we kind of just let it sit and float closer to shore. Since both of us were like, yeah, I don't really feel like swimming out there to try and see what it is. After everything that had happened, I mean, it felt like just something else that could go wrong. So, as it made its way a little closer to shore, whatever it was, I could start to see more and more of what it was. It appeared to be some large dark shape. So, I jumped in the lake, and now I'm about waist high, trying to get closer to this object that's bobbing in and out of the water. That's when I noticed to my horror, and this is when I completely lose it. The object bobbing in and out of the water, was a decaying body. And what was worse, had this large object sticking out of this corpse's chest. It was like some metal rectangle or something. It was unlike anything I've ever seen. I freaked out, swam back to shore quickly, losing my mind, not sure what to think. So, this girl and I ran all the way around the shore, got in contact with my dad and my brother, who they both could see this object floating along the lake too, but they had no idea it was a body. In a panic, all four of us run back to where our car is. We call the police. The police show up, and they inspect and pull the body out. Now, of course, you have more officers showing up, and we're getting questioned. I'll spare you all the irrelevant and boring details, but basically what happened is that when she must have done a deep dive, she must have hit some loose patch of mud or something underneath that dislodged this body, which caused it to ascend to the surface and float. And we have no idea who it was that drowned or died, but as they pulled the body out, we all saw more of the object that was completely lodged in this person's chest. It was alien-like. It was very strange. And I really don't have any way to describe it because of how bizarre it was. I could tell you that the person who died was a male, but I could not tell you anything about what they looked like, how old they were, nothing. They were too badly decomposed, but still had flesh and stuff on their body. This was easily one of the most traumatizing, terrorizing camping trips we'd ever had. And no, we did not end up camping out that night. We drove home. Death of a black bear. This happened when I was about 10 years old. My dad and I would go on camping solo trips sometimes, and my dad and I, at this point, went to a lake camping. We had a nice campfire, and my dad, wanting to teach me how to be more of a man, decided that, at my age, I should be able to go off and collect a decent amount of firewood to bring back. He explained to me, "All right, son, I'm going to hold down the fort. You go and collect a nice bundle of firewood. Here's a flashlight. Don't wander off too far." Feeling confident and not wanting to disappoint my father, I felt more than adequate enough with the skills I possessed at the time to go and complete the task at hand. We had done many solo camping trips together, so it's not like he was just throwing me into the fray. I happily obeyed and scurried off into the darkest patch of woods I could find to prove to him, at my tender years of age, that I was brave enough and man enough to complete the task. Making my father proud was all I cared about in that moment. So I'm digging, and I'm finding some dry kindling, some random dry pieces of wood from a dead, fallen tree nearby, and I'm looking and I'm looking. And as I wander off farther and farther away from camp, I start to hear some strange noises. Now, let me just explain for a second. These weren't like stepping on leaves noises or crunching of sticks. This was the sound of animals fighting, at least what I thought was animals fighting. It was squealing and groaning, all sorts of strange noises, and being curious and 10 years old, I kind of couldn't help but be drawn to this. So, with it being pretty dark out, I kind of fought with the logic of myself, being like, well, I shouldn't wander too far away from my father, but at the same time, I gotta get down to business and find out what this noise is. So I wandered off a little further, down a small hill, where the noise was growing louder and louder. Now, at the point where I could see what was going on, I was maybe roughly 10 minutes away from my father, and I had a perfect view of the horror that lay beneath just a little bit further down the hill. This is where I have to stop writing and just explain to you that I understand what I'm about to type. It might seem crazy, and at 10 years old, I had no idea how to process what I was seeing. Knowing what I do now, I have no idea how shining my flashlight in this direction did not get this thing's attention. Maybe it didn't care. I don't know. So, I shine my flashlight, and it doesn't directly illuminate what I'm seeing, but it illuminates the general area, that I can see that this tall, hairy biped is physically fighting with this large black bear. So much so that it was a violent brawl. I shine my light, and I see this big hairy man reach down, grab this black bear by the arm, grab it with its other arm by the black bear's neck, pull, twist, and pop. This man or thing rips off the right forearm of this bear like it was nothing, like it was some sort of chicken leg being pulled off a rotisserie chicken. It looked effortless. The black bear screamed in pain as blood emerged and squirted all over. This thing literally grabbed the black bear by the throat and choked it out, killing it within seconds. After seeing this, I had somehow managed to get my legs to work to run back up the hill, spilling my entire semi-small bundle of wood all over and completely urinating and defecating my pants. I sprinted back to my father as fast as I could, explaining to him in acute detail what I had seen. And I'm very surprised. He took me very seriously. I'm glad he did, because there was no way I could fake being that shooken up. He just commanded me to go hide in the tent, and he pulled out his .45 and told me he would stay out and protect if need be. Nothing happened the rest of that night, and luckily I had brought a change of clothes that I was able to change out of and get cleaned up. But that still is one of the freakiest things I've ever seen in my life. Now that I'm older, I suspect what I saw was a Bigfoot fighting off a black bear, and I'm not sure what the fighting was about. As a matter of fact, I don't think it was ever the Bigfoot making the noise. I think this Bigfoot, whatever it was taunting this black bear. And right when I shine my light, I think it just happened to be the same moment that this Bigfoot decided to attack, because it took down that black bear like it was nothing. And being an adult, I've seen multiple adult black bear, and this black bear was not a dainty small black bear. This was probably a full-grown male. It was a good-sized bear, as some black bears get. And to know that this Bigfoot thing just grabbed hold of this black bear like it was nothing, rip its arm off, and then crush its windpipe effortlessly like it did. That's terrifying. That is straight up nightmare fuel. These days, I don't do near as much camping, but it's not a direct result of that. It's just being a family man and having kids and a wife, I don't have near as much time. But if anybody ever asks me if I've ever seen anything weird or if I've ever seen a Bigfoot, I always whip out this story and tell them as honestly and truthfully as I can. The creature in the woods. It all started off late one evening, after a short walk in the woods. I felt what I can describe as a presence, and I turned to see this large, man-like creature standing there, just in the tree line, watching me, covered from head to toe in hair. And I got a pretty good look at him. His face and eyes were very dark. I couldn't make out much of his eyes, but I could tell they were either fully black or dark brown. His skin was dark, but not black, and very leathery. And he was almost perfectly still. He never showed any teeth, or really showed any or much expression at all. Instead, his mouth remained closed in a very serious, mono-expressive way, staring at me like a statue. I felt this strong sense of fear and urgency rush over me. I just knew deep down I had to get away from him. I was absolutely terrified, yet I knew if I did not get away, something bad would happen. I tried to back away slowly without making a sound, and I only managed to get about 2 steps away from him. As I kept moving, it, or he, whatever this thing was, began following me in the same direction. I began moving my pace quicker and quicker, while backtracking and keeping my eyes on this thing. It, or he, began to follow me more, and now its demeanor changed from statue-like and calm to very hostile in nature, and even pursued me. I won't lie, I ran for my life, even though I'd always heard from hunters growing up. Never run. It always gives incentive for predators to chase. But, in that moment, I lost all sort of common sense and rationale. I was convinced I was done for, and there was nothing I could do about that. After running full on for about 2 minutes, I could hear this thing crashing through the large brush, smacking into trees, knocking stuff down, and then it began to scream really loudly. It was the most god-awful, inhuman scream I've ever heard in my life. I can't even imagine hearing something like that out in the woods again. So I just kept running and running. And it's almost like this thing wasn't necessarily trying to catch up with me, but trying to drive me out. Because it was so large and fast, I believe it could have caught up to me if it wanted to, grabbed me, and pulled me apart like some paper rag doll. But it did not. It stayed concealed behind enough trees and brush to make sure I was driven out of the area. This was easily one of the most terrifying moments of my life. After I made it back into the sidewalk, out from the woods, I literally collapsed on the ground and let out a massive sigh of relief. I was back. I was safe. I didn't have to face whatever that thing was anymore. I could breathe easy. Thank God. And I also heard whatever that was stop entirely. I took my opportunity and I ran as fast home as I could, not wasting a second. Of course, I didn't bother telling anybody because who would believe a kid like me? Well, luckily, that's why there's online communities for this sort of thing. I felt safe reaching out to somebody like you who seems to know a lot about the paranormal, cryptids, and whatnot. At least that's what I planned on. And if you share my story, I would really appreciate it if you kept my name out of it. Just, I know how these sorts of things backfire on people. That's all. Anyway, enjoy. Consuming light. I can't give you the exact coordinates, because to be honest, I don't exactly remember. What I can tell you was, me and my friend were in the deep thicket south of Crater Lake. My friend and I were heading west, going up a rather large ridge. It was also now getting nighttime too. We were properly equipped, we had flashlights, and plenty of other things to keep us alive and safe out in the woods. We're not noobs at all. We're quite experienced. At least, I would like to think we are. But let me just go off and say that, besides the flashlights, the stars and the moon in the sky, you're out in the middle of the woods. There's no reason, unless there's another camper, that there should be anybody else around. I just want to make that clear. Now, as we're coming up this large ridge, my friend and I both see it off in the distance. It being this large thing of light. We couldn't really tell what it was from the distance we were. It looked like a large beam, but it wasn't like coming from the sky. It was just this thing of light, like a ball, and it was pretty large. Out of curiosity, and mildly creeped out, we continued walking toward the light, and it only seemed to get brighter. As we approached it, we could see it was in this rather large clearing, and it was just this massive orb of light, easily the size of a 2-story house, actually. And surrounding the light was blackness, not like the night, but it's almost as if this light had a stroke or some sort of barrier of blackness around it, like pitch black ink black. It was hard to see where the light ended and the night began. This was no beam of light. There was no source. It was just a sphere of light floating right here, and it was getting brighter and brighter. And looking back as I recall these very vivid, interesting moments, I really can't tell you what was going through my mind. Was I having a near-death experience? Perhaps an out-of-body experience? Was I encountering a demon, an angel, an alien, or simply just hallucinating? I don't know. I don't even know if those thoughts went through my head, if we're honest. But I remember almost being in this trance, where I was being drawn towards this light. My friend grabs hold of my arm very tightly, and is pulling me back the direction we came. He seemed extremely panicked, his face completely pale. And he's yelling at me, "Come on, we gotta go now." And eventually, my trance at some point was broken, and he dragged me along, and I followed after. But I curiously kept looking back, wondering what this beam was. After we made it a few minutes later, the light seemed to move and vanish. Where it went, we don't know. We both sat there, in the dark, with only our flashlights, and the stars above us, both completely wondering what had just happened. We speculate it could have been an alien craft. Maybe it was spiritual. We don't know. But all I know is it's impossible for it to be some sort of mechanical device or something operated by a person. We're out here miles in the woods by ourselves. There's not a soul out here. And I don't care what you say. There's no flashlight, there's no LED spotlight, nothing that can illuminate as much light like that thing did, in the size that it did. And I also can't describe the weird trance that it put me in. It's like it had control over me, like it was drawing me in, pulling me closer and closer, like it wanted me. And physically, it's like I could not say no. Very strange, Easily, perhaps the strangest thing I've ever encountered being out in the woods. I'm sorry if this story isn't exactly scary material, but I thought you would find it interesting. I've had many adventures out in the woods myself, and out of everything I've experienced or encountered, this one takes the cake. Little ones. It was April of this year, about the same time every year that I start collecting and hoarding firewood. I live in a pretty big house out in the countryside, and due to having a shoddy wood stove to heat the entire house and no real electric heating, I go through roughly 5 or 6 cords of wood a year. Now, you may know that buying cords of wood, well, it can get expensive, and I'd rather trade my hard-earned time than deal with that kind of pricing. And you can imagine that living rural, cords of wood, good quality cords, don't come cheap, especially if they're seasoned. And having all the necessary tools and having logging experience, I just find it easier myself to go and track down dead fallen trees and do all the nitty-gritty. So that's exactly what I was doing on this beautiful spring day in April. Unfortunately, in order to get access to all these fallen trees, my venture is quite a ways away from home, 50 miles to be exact, but it's just a part of the gig. So on this day, I'm out there scouting, and I come to a section off the road where there's a whole lot of fallen dead trees. You have to be careful too of the rot in them. Sometimes they won't be fully seasoned either, and so, after spotting a nice grouping of all these dead fallen trees, I make it a point to come back. I took down the coordinates, marked down the mile marker, everything I know, so I can come back to this exact location and get what I needed to fill the back of my truck up with rounds that I could later split. But something interesting happens along the way. I get out of my truck and I'm checking out all these fallen dead trees. It wasn't like I came to an area where there was just a bunch altogether. It's pretty common to find fallen dead trees all throughout the woods, especially if you go into areas where there's a lot of just dead growth. That's kind of what like this was. And as I'm scanning some of the dead trees just to make sure they're seasoned or not, I begin hearing what I could have sworn was a snickering, except it sounded high-pitched. I quickly turn around but don't see anybody there. So I was convinced that I was somehow losing it. Whatever, I thought. I go back to try and prying open this part of a log that was kind of ripped open anyway, just to check the wood. And I hear something like a pitter-pattering running behind me. I turn, and to my shock, I see this little being, maybe no more than a foot tall, and kind of like this dark green, yellow, vomity looking skin. Completely taken aback, I nearly collapse onto my bottom, in shock and sight of whatever this little thing is. It quickly darts off into the thicket, off to my left, only being visible to my own eyes for no more than 2 seconds. I immediately pulled myself up, looked around, and that's when I could hear more noises. Shuffling, rustling, more snickering. Was I in the Twilight Zone? Or maybe some sort of 80s fantasy horror movie? I wasn't going to take any chances. I ran as fast and as hard as I could back to my truck, got in, and said, you know what? I don't care how much dead wood is here, screw it. I'm heading out. And I pulled out of there as quick as I could without wasting a second. Smoke billowing behind me from my tires screeching on the gravel. I didn't care about damaging my tires, my axle, anything. I don't know what I saw, and I can't explain what I saw. I think that's why it disturbs me so much. I don't dare want to entertain the idea that I possibly saw a goblin or a fairy or a gnome, but I don't know what else this would be. I mean, it didn't look like a typical fantasy goblin, like you see depicted by many illustrations, but it was really ugly looking and had that kind of dark yellow-green skin. Looked kind of scaly and had a very ugly face. But again, it all happened so fast, I didn't get to catch every single detail. I just saw a faint glimpse of it, and it ran off. I'm writing to you because I value your opinion. You've given so many people such good advice and helped them through their own encounters. Will you give me advice for mine and help me through what I saw? Shadow of the Forest. Hey, yo, what lurks beneath? How's it going? Longtime fan here, or as I should say, lurker. I just want to state that this isn't my own personal encounter story, but it's one that's been passed down from a friend of mine who wants me to share it with you personally. So I'll tell you all the details that they've written down. I'm going to do my best to keep all their details anonymous, out of respect. Now, back in the 60s, in Western New York, the state, not the city, a family of 5 moved into a new house kind of tucked away in the middle of the woods. There's quite a bit of development there now, but at the time, there was very, very minimal amounts. In fact, I think most of it was woods, with this house kind of carved right into it. Not much of a yard around it either. I don't think the house was any older than 30 years, actually, when it was purchased. The original owner, who was also a logger, I guess had hung himself in the basement and was left to rot there for weeks and weeks until a family relative found him there. The house sat on the market for quite a while when this family of 5 purchased it and moved into the home. They say to me that right off the bat, things just did not seem right about the house. It just had a different feeling than any of the other houses they ever visited. But, with the kids really loving that they're right in the middle of the woods, and them overall loving the house, they found nothing abruptly wrong. Not enough for them to say no and to leave. It was a pretty good-sized house, too. Large enough to house their family of 5. Very comfortably, mind you. There was even a little wood shop outside that kind of was like a mini lumber mill, since the previous owner was indeed a logger and did a lot of his own woodworking and projects. Now, this is where the story kind of changes pace. You're probably thinking that this is going to be a haunted house story. But actually, even though the house and the whole property had a weird feeling, there was never any paranormal experiences that I was told about that occurred in the house. It was actually a more terrifying thing because the paranormal experiences that happened were actually all in the woods around the house. And it started with the children. They reported seeing this large, and when I say large, I'm talking about maybe 8 or 9 feet tall, black shadow man, as they called it, that would watch them with red eyes from the tree line, staring them, watching them. Sometimes when they would turn to face it, it would just vanish. How did they know it was that tall? Well, their dad was a pretty tall man, 6'7", just a really big guy, and they knew this thing was much taller than their dad. And this went on for quite some time, since they lived in the house for years and years. There was no specific season, no time of day, no time of year that this thing would more frequently appear. It was just at random, and it would always go after the kids, like it enjoyed preying upon them, staring in their windows at night, scaring them, just seeing this black shadow of a man with glowing red eyes. After a while, the kids started to get really upset about this, and eventually broke the news to the parents, who were completely unaware of seeing this mysterious shadow man, at least for the first few months, until the kids were like, "Hey, Mom and Dad, there's this thing, it's making me really uncomfortable. It's this big shadow person with red eyes, glaring at me, staring into my soul every night. I can't do it." Of course, the parents did not believe the kids at first, but decided to take their inquiries a little more seriously, after they too, after a few more months, began spotting the same ghastly apparition, as you would likely say. The family, not being the religious type, had to enlist the help from the local Catholic priest, who did a pretty shoddy job of cleansing the house and the surrounding property around it. It only seemed to make this being more angry, more aggressive, and more frequent. Well, the story expands, and I already know right off the bat, as I'm going to tell you these details, This story sounds like some sort of elaborate creepypasta. I know, but bear with me. The father was doing some remodeling down in the basement. The basement was left in pretty bad shape. And as the dad is doing some desperate remodeling, he finds an old book, covered in dust, pretty worn away. It was probably no older than 20-30 years, that had just been sitting there, tucked away in a crevice in the wall. Upon looking into it, it turns out that this book was the writings and ramblings of a madman, the journal to the man that used to live there, the one who hung himself. There was all sorts of crazy stuff written in it, like help me, it's taking over me, spells, incantations, and deep, in-depth notes about occultic rituals and sacrifices. As it turns out, the logger who lived here before, the one who hung himself in the basement, was deep into the occult, practiced rituals and magic, and also seemed to be driven insane and driven to the brink of suicide by what he described in his journal as demons. But one particular demon, the Shadow Man, as he called it in his journal, the one that convinced him to hang himself. Half believing and also very disturbed by his findings, the dad decided to burn the journal in hopes that this was just some sort of sick prank, maybe some sort of elaborate art project, or maybe it was just a joke. But the dad found out that the journal would not burn. He even went as far as covering it in lighter fluid, or gasoline, dousing the sucker, trying to torch it. It would not burn. It would catch fire, but the pages, the leather binding, would not disintegrate. After trying and trying, he eventually just threw it away. And no, it's not like in the movies where the book came back. But the Shadow Man never disappeared from the property. It still stayed there, becoming ever more aggressive, to where it nearly threatened all their lives. After a few more years down the road, the family had finally had enough, and they decided to move back towards the city. It was actually perfect timing too, because the dad had just started a new career, and it was a convenient move for him. And that in and of itself started a whole new line of drama, that the dad only moved because it was convenient for him and his work, and not because the family could not take the torment of this being anymore. But that's irrelevant to the story. After the family moved out, I guess the dad had kept in touch with another fellow who actually bought the house from him and moved in shortly after they moved out. Apparently, he was fine, never had any issues. But then again, now, the last the dad had heard, he believes, and he told me, don't quote me on this, but he believes that development was all torn down and redeveloped in the late 1980s. Maybe for a neighborhood, or maybe a commercial zone, or apartment complex, something. He's not 100%, but he believes that that house and that whole surrounding property with the woods is now gone. Either way, whether it's there or not, personally, I don't want to step foot anywhere around there. Stranded, broken, and on the menu. I had been studying for quite some time to get my degree in music, while I was working as a waitress. At the time, I worked at a bar called the Silver Dollar. It's closed now, but I was originally hired to be a singer. Things didn't really work out, and I ended up taking over as a waitress. I was a very proud, diligent worker, but when I wasn't working at the bar, I would try and spend all my free time in the woods. I was an avid outdoorswoman, and I don't mean to be too proud, but a skilled archer. My weapon of choice was always the bow, a hand bow that I had carved completely by hand, taught by my grandfather. One day, which, by the way, I did not have any of my weapons on me. It was just a sort of leisurely hike. I was walking along the woods on my way to work, and I was headed towards a favorite spot of mine. I always loved it because you could see the elk and other animals around. I was feeling great. It was a beautiful day, nice out, and the sun was shining. The birds were singing, and I just had this overwhelming sense of peace. And as I walked along the trails, like I had many times before to get to work, I came across this very disturbed area of forest. I can't explain why it was disturbed, but I felt it in my spirit, in my gut, my entire being. There was a large area of trees that were kind of cut into a straight line, and a large patch of ground that was dug up. I thought maybe I was just seeing things, or maybe somebody had been out here, but as I looked closer, I could see that there was a large hole that was dug out, with rocks all around it. I thought, how strange. I couldn't imagine who or why anybody would do this. And keep in mind, the rocks around this hole weren't just casual size. They were large, maybe a few feet by a few feet. Heavy, hundreds of pound boulders. Something about this whole thing just did not sit right with me. And I get this feeling like I'm in danger. So I'm like, all right, I need to head back in the direction that I came from and actually just drive to work. Even though I'll be late, I knew my boss would be understanding. As I was making my way back, I began hearing a rustling in the forest. I looked around but couldn't see anything. So I decided to keep walking. I tried my best to stay calm. But now, I was beginning to get a little worried. I could feel that there was something following me. I just could not see it. I could hear it following me from behind the trees. I still could not see it. Now, I was beginning to get really nervous and becoming very scared. I convinced myself I needed to run, despite everything I'd ever learned about being in the woods. I just didn't want to run and make it seem like I was running from it, in case whatever this animal was could sense my fear. As I'm picking up my pace, I end up tripping on a rock, falling flat on my face. Now I'm laying there on the ground, trying to get my body back up, but I'm in so much pain and I could barely move. As I was in pain, I could hear what sounded like this animal, which sounded bipedal to me, approaching me. It was coming closer and closer, and now I was truly scared. The fear was so intense that I was trembling, and my body was shaking. I was trying to get up, but I just was in so much pain that I could not. And now, I was beginning to get more than scared. I was full on panicking. And that's when I realized I could not get up. My body would not let me. And for the first time, I turned to see my assailant. This creature was no longer a human, not the way I'd envisioned. This thing couldn't have been more than 5 feet tall, hunched over, had rocky, nasty black skin, and 2 large fangs, and it looked like some sort of awful cross between a troll, a gorilla, and some sort of rock creature. I can't even begin to describe to you what it looked like. It was horrible. It made its way over to me, and I just closed my eyes. I lay there, and for the first time in my life, I accepted fate, that I knew what was coming. Death, the inevitable. I felt it lean down, grab hold of my leg, grab my foot, and with one quick twist, completely snapped and broke my ankle. I remember screaming in pain and agony, as this thing then grabbed my other leg and started dragging me off into the woods. I was screaming and crying, terrified I was going to die, no longer just accepting fate, but trying to fight for my will to live. And I'm kicking, and I'm fighting, and I'm screaming, and I'm doing everything I can to distract this thing or garner attention from, God, hopefully anybody else is around to help me. And it then quickly gets tired of my antics, turns around, grabs my other leg, grabs my foot like before, and a quick twist. Snaps my other ankle like it was nothing. Now I'm even screaming more in pain and on the verge of passing out from the intense amount of pain. Tell me, imagine getting your foot caught and having your foot completely twisted at a 90-degree angle sideways. That's what this thing did. It was intelligent. It knew to break my ankles completely. I can't even begin to tell you how painful, the agony I went through. Well, as it was dragging me, after breaking both my ankles, I fell unconscious. I awoke maybe a couple hours later, but I really have no idea how to tell time, at least after that moment. I was in the middle of the forest floor, pumped full of adrenaline, still feeling the excruciating pain, and this thing was not anywhere around, at least that I could see visibly. So, like any harrowing survival tale, I threw myself onto my stomach and crawled, and I crawled, and I crawled, since my legs were virtually useless. And I can't tell you how long I crawled on my hands and stomach. It felt like forever. It felt like hours, and even up a small hill, to where I made it, to this road I was not familiar with, but turns out was only about 2 miles away from where I work. I literally collapsed into one of the lanes of the road and went unconscious again. After that, I woke up in the hospital. Apparently some man was driving by, stopped because he just sees this body of a woman lying in the road, gets out to help me, sees that I'm unconscious, and sees that my ankles are swollen and badly broken. Obviously, you know what happens next. An ambulance gets called, I get taken to the hospital, and I'm patched and treated for the wounds that I endured. But the man who rescued me remained anonymous, and I never got to thank him. Just a fellow good Samaritan, I guess. And whatever creature that thing was, I don't know. I was convinced for the longest time, and still kind of am, that it was sent to come after me from the pits of hell. That's what it looked like. And had I not flopped myself onto my stomach and crawled out of there, I firmly believe it was on its way back to do God only knows what to me. Kill me, torture me, maim me some more. I don't want to know. And honestly, writing this story out has been extremely therapeutic, very helpful. It's kind of helped me think back and just deal with the emotions and thoughts. Because other than writing this, I haven't really tried to process these feelings or these thoughts in a long time. It's kind of being a hard story to write. It's bringing up a lot of past emotions, but you know what? This is good to write about. It's good to get it out. And I'm just glad that I'm giving you the opportunity to share this with other viewers, and hope she'll read this, and hope that other people hear this and know that if they have something like this happen to them, they too can share their story without fear of ridicule or embarrassment, and know that ultimately it will help them further their life. Spirit in the Woods. It was a cold late November night. My brother Steve and I had spent the entire day snowmobiling in the northern woods of Wisconsin. It was getting too dark to snowmobile, so we returned to our cabin nearby on a lake. It was beautiful, a very wonderful fall evening. The view from the lake was spectacular, and somehow, over by the lake, there wasn't as much snow as you would think, meaning traversing around was much more manageable. There were still some clear, crisp leaves on some of the trees, but most of it was now all dead. And the lake this evening was a special deep blue. Steve, my brother, lit the wood-burning stove and put a pot of water to boil. He added his special blend of herbs. In the woods, just a few hundred yards behind our cabin, we had built a small altar to honor the spirits of the woods. It was a small stone altar with a copper bowl. We had placed a quartz crystal and a wand and a small branch of old oak with a ribbon. It was almost dark by now. I stepped out on the deck, and the woods were only a few yards away. I could hear a sound among the wind, among the trees. As I stood there, looking off into the woods, I could feel the presence of something more around me. I took a deep breath and tried to distinguish it as a sense of peace. I thought about the altar. I knew that there would be more than just us here, I knew the water was ready. Steve poured the tea into a mug. I took a sip and could taste his tea. It was a very nice blend, and it would give me everything I need to be prepared for what I was about to do. I felt spiritualized. I knew that it was time to go to this altar. To give you some more information, the way I felt about it, I was drawn to it by this unknown force I just can't quite describe. But I knew it was calling me in, closer and closer. I then left my brother in the warmth of the cabin. I walked the short distance through the deep woods towards the altar. I continued to feel the energy around me change. It became almost more magnetic, electrifying, if you will. It was almost as if I were being pulled by the power of the woods itself, like I was being led, and yet somehow enjoying every moment. I reached the altar and was surprised to see the crystal was glowing. This was odd because we had just left not long ago. I stood there looking at it, and I began to see figures around me. Not whole figures, but more like auras, and I knew I was not alone. The ribbon we had left was also gone from the branch. I was a little unnerved by this. This meant that these beings could interact with our physical world. Talk about unnerving. I knew that spirits were now surrounding me. I stood my ground and tried to bask in the spirit of the woods, partially terrified and partially in a sense of tranquility. I felt that I had entered a place I probably should not have been. As I began to leave, I could hear a loud crash coming from the woods. I looked over to see a large tree falling from a great height. The tree nearly split in half as it fell to the ground, destroyed by some unforeseen force. The trunk nearly bursting off and landing feet away from me. I was amazed at the force. It was as if there was a force or spirit tearing the tree down. I had never seen this happen before. I knew there was something different. It was clear that we had obviously provoked something. I felt privileged there to witness this, but disturbed at the same time, with a sense of awe and wonder. I kind of took it all in. I never felt anything like it. I walked back to the cabin, sat down with my brother, and told him what had happened. He was more impressed than I was. I told him that I would leave the branch and also dismantle the altar. We should also take the crystal too. It didn't seem like a good place, after all. I often remember this day, and it's a firm reminder to me to respect and be careful of things in the woods. I believe that whatever this spirit was displaying its power, taunting me. And maybe, just maybe, we set up our altar in the wrong part of the woods. That tree that fell could have very easily crushed and destroyed me had I done something more or anything to anger it. The Goat Man. It was a very hot and humid night on the summer of 2012, out in the backwoods of Kentucky, my home state. I was lying down in my tent, trying to get some sleep before a long hike the next day. I had just laid down when I heard a very loud crack and rustling in the nearby bush. At first, I didn't think much of it. You're out here in the backwoods and there's tons of wildlife. That's always the case. But then I heard another, and then another. Each one seemed to be getting closer, and not like an animal, like it was planned, like a person. Then I heard this low, guttural growling sound, and a loud snapping of branch. I rolled over, unzipped my tent to peek outside. All I saw was a brief glimpse of a large, dark, shaggy body moving very quickly through the woods. This is when my fear set in. The sound of hooves hitting the ground was steady, but kind of a slow rhythm. It sounded familiar. After a few seconds, I realized it was not far from me, maybe 10 feet. Now, I was terrified. I closed my eyes and tried to pretend I was asleep, but I could feel something staring me down. I slowly opened my eyes to see the creature just a few feet away from my tent, its eyes glowing this intense yellow. I couldn't make out what it was, but it was taller than a human and had the head shape similar to that of a goat. It was kind of hunched over with a very, very thick body. Its fur kind of seemed shaggy, matted, and very dirty, and it had a powerful stench that smelt like death. It continued to stare at me, but did not make any other move. The creature remained there for what seemed like hours. I was terrified and could not move. Then it turned and walked away from me. I was shaking so much I couldn't even fathom what was going on. I didn't know what else to do. I lay there with my eyes, hoping it would leave, and I could hear it walking back and forth, all around the camp, growling, breaking off branches. It was terrifying, truly. This went on for about a good 20 minutes. Then, I didn't hear it anymore. I thought I could hear it off in the distance, so I peeked outside of my tent to maybe see where it had gone. Again, I know this was not human. I don't know what kind of creature this was. What I saw was something out of this world. If anyone has any idea of what this was, I would love to hear about it. Too long didn't read. A creature outside my tent growling, snapping branches. Oh, I have been asked by many people if I was scared that this thing would eat me. I don't know why, but I wasn't. I was more afraid this thing was going to kill me in the unknown. Even though this thing was terrifying, it made no direct aggressive moves towards me. It just seemed to be watching, waiting. I've also been asked about the location of this encounter, so I'm not going to give it away exactly, but it's in a very secluded area, south in Kentucky. It is known to be a hot spot for paranormal activity. I'm not saying this creature was distinctly paranormal, like not physical, but it did appear to be unknown. I've also been to this spot many times since, and crazy, I know. I will continue to go. I know that whatever I saw was not a bear, wolf, or any other animal I'm familiar with. The creature went unnoticed by other campers in the area that night. I'm sure it goes unseen often. Also, I had bear spray with me at the time, but I never uncapped it. I was too scared to shoot. I thought maybe it would attack me. And in hindsight, I really regret not trying to shoot it. Mysterious pale creature. We were driving about 5 miles south of Potsdam, New York, around 4 p.m. on a Sunday afternoon. In the summertime, the sun sets here around 8:30 or 9 p.m., and we were driving down this old dirt logging road. I'm in the passenger seat, my friend is driving. I'm looking out the window when I see something I can't really explain. There was a little clearing on the side of the road, and there was a dead tree right in the middle of the clearing. The tree was about 25 feet tall and was dead. It was down and laying partially across the road. Not so much so that you couldn't drive past it, but just enough that it did cause some sort of hindrance. As we had to swerve around it, I saw something standing by the base of the tree that was concealed before you drove by it. It was very tall, and what I could see of it was standing on its hind legs, completely bipedal. It was white, pale white, like a fleshy white, and had a very disturbing looking face. It was standing there, and it looked straight ahead. Actually, I don't know if you game at all, but the one thing it reminded me of, there are these creatures called Redes in Legend of Zelda: Ocarina of Time. Again, I don't know if you play that game, but that's exactly what the face of this thing reminded me of. Anyway, it appeared to be looking in our direction, but it was hard to tell. I didn't see any eyes, just deep black holes where the eyes should have been. The creature then turned and took one large step, just off in the distance, and then kind of disappeared behind more trees. I couldn't believe what I'd just seen. I told my friend. I was like, dude, did you see that? It was all white. I could tell he was scared. He just told me, that's not possible. But that's not what he meant. He meant it as what I saw as a bad omen. Not like that it's impossible for us to see this thing. We drove back to his house, and we're talking about what we had just saw. He told me, I've heard about things like this happening. He'd heard stories when you're driving in the woods and you see something like this. It's supposed to mean bad things are coming. He said that if something like this happens, you should never, for whatever reason, stop your car. You keep driving. If you stop, whatever it was will try to get into your car, pull you out, and devour you. He said that he's heard other stories about people disappearing and never being seen again. I've never heard anything like this before, but after I saw this creature, I believed him. I've never really told anybody else about this experience, at least until now, and I've been to the same spot since this happened. I've never seen anything like this again. At all, actually. I'm not making this up. I'm not some sort of hoodlum. I don't believe in Bigfoot or Sasquatch, any of that. But what I saw that day, I can't explain. I have always been a pretty open-minded person, to an extent. Unfortunately, I don't feel that with the descriptions given, it really fits into the idea of something like a Bigfoot anyway. Maybe more on the lines of paranormal. That much I can guarantee. Attacked by a bat creature. I was four-wheeling at a special spot here, deep in the woods of Ohio. This is in a very remote location, with nobody around for miles and miles. I decided to go camping with a good friend of mine. We set up camp in the deep woods just off the main trail. There was nobody around, so we had a nice campfire and decided to call it a night. We both went to sleep in our tents. That's at some time in the middle of the night, I woke up to a strange sound. It sounded like a train. At least, that's how loud it was. It was so loud that I thought something was going to burst through the woods right into my tent. I quickly jumped up, opened up the flap of my tent, and realized it was not coming through the woods, but in the sky above the woods. And in that moment, I see this large dark shadow flying over my tent. I could see the silhouette of this creature, and it had these large bat wings and a long, spaded tail. It was bizarre looking. It was kind of circling while slowly descending, and it had these large, strange glowing eyes. I was shocked, but I could not believe what I saw. I had no idea what this was. I thought about pulling out my phone and taking pictures, but it was far too dark to get anything worthwhile. Trust me. Eventually, it seemed to fly away, but that's all I can go by is the sound. I had ran back to my tent and hid, and this thing began swooping lower and lower, all while giving me a false hope that it was gone. Then it let out this awful, what I can only describe as a crow noise, and I could hear its wings flapping. And then, as it got closer, I could hear it let out this demonic breathing, this It must have circled my tent for a good 15 minutes. I could hear it was directly above me. I was terrified, white as a sheet. There was nothing I could do. This thing was so huge, and out of the blue, this thing dives down like an airplane and nearly tearing my tent in two. I fly out of my sleeping bag and fly out of my tent, noping out of there. In one swoop motion, I jump on my four-wheeler, not looking back, and fled down the trail in the middle of the night, not caring I was half naked and this thing was shredding my tent into pieces. As far as I knew, my friend was also back there, Then, I hear this thing following me, flying towards me in the sky, and I could hear it getting closer. So now I'm going full speed on my four-wheeler down the trail, and it's probably midnight, 1 in the morning, 2 in the morning, judging by where the moon is sitting in the sky. And I could hear it above me. It's now letting out that same sound as before, this demonic crow caw thing. This went on for nearly 3 miles. I kept thinking it was going to reach out and grab me, tear me in two. I also remember seeing a strange red light enveloping this creature, and it eventually flew away and disappeared. Either that, or decided to take coverage in the woods. Come to find out, my friend had also fled long before I did, and was hiding back of the truck. He was terrified and had also seen it. We both, sad to say, kind of abandoned each other without realizing it. He too had seen the same creature, but claims he saw it earlier in the night, before I woke up. We never spoke of it after that night. I mean, it's just too strange. We agreed to never camp in that spot. I have no idea what it was, and I can't find anything on the internet that looks remotely like what I saw. I've never seen anything that big either. It must have been at least 12 feet tall from the ground up. The way it towered over the trees, and it was so loud. It was nothing like I've ever seen or heard before. And trust me, this is the weirdest story I've ever told. I don't know if this was a real creature or maybe a dream, but I don't know. And part of me speculates that this was maybe, hear me out, a living dinosaur. Nothing adds up. Nothing explains what this could have been. I don't even know if I even believe myself sometimes. If you have any suggestions, or maybe you've had a similar experience, or know of somebody who's had a similar experience, please let me know. Give me that closure. Thanks for reading. The White Bigfoot. My name is Wyatt, and I live near the Ozark Mountains. This is important because lots of strange stuff happens all around here. Aliens, Bigfoot, strange sights and sounds, lights in the sky, you name it. This whole area has been nothing but a hotbed for things of that sort forever. And I was lucky, or unlucky enough, to have my very own personal experience with something I just can't explain. Here's my story. It was around 11 p.m. on a Wednesday night. I was driving home from a friend's house. I was a bit tired, having worked hard all day. I'm a software developer, so I feel like that's important when it comes to this kind of encounter. I'm a very critical and rational thinker, as if my job requires that. So, here I am. I'm driving a little slower than usual. I'm telling you this because I wasn't exactly paying attention to my surroundings. I was pretty tired. I was just driving aimlessly, and I was coming around a curve in the road when I saw a deer standing in the middle. I slowed down and began to swerve around it. As I was swerving, I saw something moving in the woods on the right side of the road. I didn't pay too much attention to it. I was just trying to swerve and miss the deer. I successfully swerved around the deer, and I guess I looked back to see if I was all clear, because, a lot of times, deer do not travel alone. I looked back to the road, and my eyes were drawn to the opposite side, kind of in the direction I looked. I saw something standing in the woods, maybe no more than 100 feet away. I thought it was a man at first, but immediately, I realized it was not a man in any way. It was white, looked to be maybe 8 or 9 feet tall, and appeared to be covered in white hair and what kind of reminded me of a beard. It looked like it was covered from head to toe in, hair. You might be wondering, how was I able to see this thing in the night, and especially know that it was that distance? Luckily, it was a partly full moon and just in the right spot in the sky, enough to illuminate all I needed to see for me to fully understand what it was. I looked back at the road, and I was fixing to pull my car back, but I looked back again, and this thing was gone, trying to double take. I didn't know what to think. I kept driving, and the thought made me shake. I was scared. I know for a fact this had to have been a Bigfoot. To me, it kind of looked like a big white man with a beard. I'm no paranormal researcher, but I've heard some Bigfoot stories, especially around here, and I've seldom heard of white Bigfoots. I guess they're a pretty rare sighting. Many actually believe white Bigfoots are elder Bigfoots. I think it was, but I can't be sure. But what I am sure of is that this thing was covered in a white hair. I'll have to do more research on it, since it was some sort of paranormal phenomenon. I have contacted some other paranormal researchers, and I'm going to find out what I saw that night. I just thought I'd share my encounter with you to see what you all think. I know many people think I'll probably be crazy, but I'm not. I know what I saw. Death of a brown bear. I had just started a new job and was doing my first solo night shift, working in a warehouse kind of tucked out in the countryside. At this point, it was about 11:30 p.m., and I was on the middle of a smoke break. I'd just gotten a small cup of coffee and was walking back towards the door when I heard something out back. I thought it was a large animal at first, but it sounded strange. I'd only been working there at this point for maybe about 2 weeks. So you hear all sorts of weird stuff at night, being out here. Sounds I'm not accustomed to hearing. I opened the door and walked out. I looked around, but I didn't see anything. I started walking towards where I thought the sound came from, and as I did, I saw the bushes moving. I thought it was an animal moving around, and I caught a glimpse of something large and black. I stopped. The black thing moved again. Then it appeared to disappear. I thought it was an animal, but I got a weird feeling about the whole thing. So I kind of walked around the bushes very carefully, looked in the direction this thing appeared to head, but I couldn't see anything. I kept standing there for a moment, and I heard something moving. And then I see the shape again. I couldn't tell what it was. And, stupid, I know, I decided to follow it. Hear me out. While this might sound incredibly foolish, in hindsight, I was convinced this was somebody trying to case the warehouse and break in, wearing all black, since I couldn't exactly make out who or what it was at this point. So I slowly thought I was walking after them, watching where they were going. I knew they were headed far off in the woods, and I wanted to see where they were going. I didn't think it could be a person, at least not till later on, and I had to write off the weird feeling. Now again, at this moment, I wasn't entirely sure. To add some more clarity, behind the bushes where I saw this is a small patch of tall grass before going back further, actually into a thick, wooded tree line. I followed it to the edge and stopped. Now, I was about 20 feet from the woods, and I was seeing a black object moving behind the trees. This is where I knew it wasn't a person, because this was big. That's when I realized for the first time, this was no animal I'd ever seen, heard, or known about, and it was certainly dismissed my notion of it ever being a person attempting to case the warehouse. I decided in that moment that whatever it was not worth further investigating. I said screw it, threw my cigarette down, went back to my shift as normal. The next day, I show up in the afternoon since I work different shifts, depending on the day. Everybody there is talking about there's a huge dead brown bear right off in the patch of grass. I'm like, what? I guess the manager did not want to deal with it, and instead just kept telling everybody, get back to work. Somehow to him, This was not alarming that a several 100-pound male adult brown bear was killed, mutilated, and ripped apart, only 100 feet away from our building. But yeah, nothing to be concerned about. It's just nature. When I got a chance on my break to see the horror myself, I was disgusted. The bear looked like something large had twisted and torn parts of its flesh open, pulling out guts and other parts. Its neck was partially ripped off, with much of its flesh and innards exposed from the throat. Its face was also smashed from the side, looking like a force from a large, blunt object. One of the bear's forearms was hanging by only a few tendons, appearing to be ripped or torn with immense force, not cut or sawed in any way. The bear's eyes had also appeared to have been removed, like somebody had just popped them out or something. The back legs were also twisted and mangled, as if this thing had been ran over by several semi-trucks. And the body of the bear appeared as if something had just casually tossed this brown bear corpse here. It did not die here. I don't know what happened, but seeing a bear killed like this scared the living daylights, not just out of me, but all of us. Except our manager, of course. A total D-bag. Later on in the shift, the body of the bear completely vanished without a trace. This was before I got off work. Nobody else had been outside, and the cameras did not catch that angle. I have never seen anything like it before, and I still can't believe I found a mutilated bear lying in the middle of this patch of grass right by where we work. Oh, one last side note. My warehouse for my job is kind of out in the countryside, like I said, outside of town, surrounded by lots of trees. The area is very rural. This is where there are many ranchers and farmhands. In the summer and spring, the growth gets pretty gnarly, as everything becomes overgrown and very green. It would be easy for some large predator to hide away without ever being seen. It's a good thing I didn't go pursuing it after that night, or else that bear's corpse would have been mine. There's something in the lake. It was a nice day in late June. The weather was warm. I was with my girlfriend and her daughter. We were driving to a lake where her parents were camping out. But before we got there, something happened. We decided to stop and check out this other little lake that was near the campsite. We were all pretty relaxed, excited actually. Our plan was to stop here, go meet up with her parents, and finish off the rest of our day. There were a few other cars there, not many though. A couple canoes on the other side of the lake, and a couple of kayaks. Nobody around this section of lake. This is important. We pulled up on a grassy area, got out to be a little closer to the water. At least some of my kids did. They got out, had a look around, and we were sitting in our truck, talking, watching. The sun was shining, but it was right above the horizon, so it was starting to get darker at this point. I was sitting in the driver's seat. My girlfriend was in the passenger seat. We're talking, looking at the lake, when I noticed a couple of ducks and geese swimming near the shore, just casually. Then I hear her, my girlfriend, gasp, and she yanks on the door handle. I looked at her and she was looking out the window, right at the water, and she said, "What the F is that?" I looked out the window and immediately I see this huge greenish-brown head, like a crocodile or alligator, except it wasn't an alligator. It looked similar, but it looked more human. It surfaced right near where the ducks and geese were. Its head was massive, about the size of a lion's, if I had to guess, and appeared to have a long body, maybe 8 feet from what I could gather based on what we saw. I could see the side of its face and could see an outline of its teeth behind its mouth. This thing was horrible. It dove back under the water quickly. I looked at my girlfriend, and she had her head on the door and was looking at the water. This thing, it made my head spin. I told her to look at me, go yell for other kids, and that we were going to leave. The kids jumped in, I put the truck in reverse, and backed up about 20 yards. While she was looking at the water, my daughter was now sitting in the back. I told her to buckle up and hold on. I flung off into the reverse, looking at the water one last time where I had seen the creature, and I could still see a small wake, like a boat wake. It appeared to be moving slowly. I told my girlfriend, hold on, and I drove out of there at probably 40-50 miles an hour. When I stopped, I could just sense that what we had seen was not normal. I could not shake the feeling. I'm going to say this. It's not a huge lake by any means, but it's also not a small lake, and I don't believe in Bigfoot. But I do believe what I encountered was something beyond our realm of normal. Let me just restate, this was not an alligator. It was not an animal I know of. The head was enormous, and its head was pointed instead of rounded like that of an alligator, but also human-like at the same time. Its skin was more dark brownish green, and it was also kind of like, I don't know, the cranium of a human, at least the top. At the length I was at, it was hard to make out the necessary detail to give you every accurate description. This thing was only about 50 feet from the shore, and was almost merged completely below the surface. This is what I can say for certain, after only getting a pretty decent glimpse of it, which is why I cannot say for how it looked. These are my impressions. I can say it was no animal I've ever known or seen. I've heard alligator stories, alligator gar, fish, but I don't believe this is something an alligator would do. I've had numerous encounters with strange animals, but this was by far the strangest. I believe. I know it might sound far-fetched, but this was some kind of reptilian creature. I just have no idea what. Chased by an upright wolf. I was taking a walk in the woods without a weapon of any sort. Stupid. Just my iPhone flashlight. I was walking down a dirt road that had been cut through the woods. At this point, I was maybe a mile deep into the forest. Quick side note, just so you can know why I'm here. I'm a sucker for taking lone night walks in the woods. Like most people, it really doesn't freak me out. At least until you have an encounter like mine. I didn't come across any other people or vehicles around me. It was pretty desolate. I was on my way back to my car when, all of a sudden, I hear noises off to the left of me. It started out as breathing. I turned and looked, and then, even in the dark night, I could see faintly, some large shape was pacing with me, parallel in the woods. I see the brush moving side to side, trees moving, shapes moving. I began to really take serious consideration of my surroundings. Then, I see something dark coming out of the woods, towards me, only about 30 feet away. I have to call somebody. I gotta get out of here, I thought. But of course, I was out of service. So, I get this sinking feeling that this is going to hurt me. Whatever this person is or thing is, I'm dead if I don't leave. Then, it's moving more, and it's coming towards me, quicker. That's when I froze in fear. It stopped and looked at me, or at least I thought it did. I couldn't exactly see its eyes because it was dark, but I can make out a face as it was getting closer and closer. I could see it had huge white fangs, a nose and a mouth, and looked like a wolf's head, easily twice the size the rest of its upright body. Then, it began to shuffle more towards me, after stopping momentarily. I was so scared out of my mind, I managed to work my legs into running, and it was behind me within 5 seconds. I managed to get back down to the dirt road, and ran down that. At this point, running as fast as my body could physically allow me to do. I had my phone in my hand and felt this thing getting closer and closer. I turned and it was nearly right there. But something odd. I feel like whatever this thing was could have easily caught up to me, torn me into pieces if it wanted to. It's like it was toying with me, the way a cat would with a mouse, playing before its meal is now dead. I was physically blind, or so it felt, running out into the woods without a light. I ran off the road and I ran as fast as I could when I stopped in this small patch of trees to catch my breath. I thought I had lost it for a moment, but then I looked up and I see this thing on all fours in the ground, coming towards me in the opposite direction. That's when I realized this was not the same creature that was following me. This was another one of them. I was being stalked by several of these things. I turned again and ran, and I ran, and I ran. I ran until no more breath stood in my body. I was back on the road and had come across a house not too far away. I continued to run, with these things still following me, but staying quietly concealed in the woodline. I ran up to the door, pounding on it. I was so out of breath I could not even talk. A lady who appeared very concerned came to the door. I told her to call the police. She looked at me with a blank stare, told me she didn't have a phone, and slammed the door in my face. Without thinking, I ran across the street, into the woods, and hid there. I thought I was safe for the time being, and I could hear these things wandering around, very close by, sniffing, moving, groaning, and breathing. At one point or another, all sound had completely ceased, including their noises and the crickets. My phone had died, but it was in that stage where you can turn it on and it's sitting at 0% battery, maybe seconds before literally shutting off. I was able and somehow managed to get off a 911 call, at least long enough to let the person know where I was. I stayed there, remaining hidden from any sort of sight. Police came shortly after, and I revealed myself to tell them what had happened. They didn't really take me seriously. They thought I was strung out on LSD or something, so they put me through tests. They said they didn't find any evidence of any animal, like how I described. It was more than likely probably just some big dog. I swear to God, it's not a dog. It was like a wolf, but with a wolf's face. The eyes were this golden color. The nose was long, and it had a snout, and I saw fangs, and there were more of them. Also of note, the town this happened by is Fenton. It's a historical town where they make all the witches and all other things for Halloween. The town is also very secluded, and there are a lot of things in the woods. I'm not saying these things like witchcraft are related, but it's worth noting. The state of Michigan is also known for Bigfoot sightings, among other strange things. I never really believed those things until this night. Something in the woods. I was fishing in southern Michigan at what we call a local pond. I was fishing alone and thought I was completely alone. That is, until I saw this thing. I was about to leave and I decided to fish one last hole. I was fishing and I was about 3 feet away, or 3 feet out of the water, I should say, with a spinning rod. The water was only about knee deep, but it was very clear. I was reeling in a bass when I heard a snap behind me. I turned around and I see this figure about 50 yards away from me. It appeared to be 8 feet tall, and it was walking away from me when I saw it. I didn't notice it at first, until the movement. I'm hoping it didn't notice me either. I was shocked by the sight of it. It was bipedal and very thin. It didn't have much of a neck, but it had kind of a short round head. It looked to me like it was bald. It had no facial hair, and its skin was entirely black. No hair at all. Its eyes were also dark black, and it had this large mouth full of sharp fangs. It had long arms and two very muscular looking legs. This thing would stop occasionally and size me up, acting as if I was a threat. It was looking right at me, and I was now looking right at it, and I felt like it was looking through me. And eventually, it turns away from me and just keeps walking. I was terrified. This was easily one of the scariest moments in my life. I didn't know if this thing was going to jump on me and attack me or what. And I realized something. This thing wasn't just walking away from me. It was walking around to get behind me in the woods. That's when I kind of snapped out of it. I turned around and jumped out of there as fast as I could, running back to where I parked, getting into my car and just throwing my stuff in. When I got home, I was still shaking like crazy. I immediately called my brother-in-law, who's pretty knowledgeable about stuff like dogman and Bigfoot, things that I normally laugh at him for and blow him off about. I was terrified. I even called my girlfriend, who's a pretty firm atheist. She doesn't believe in any of this stuff. I told her what had happened, and she was so freaked out by my reaction. She wanted me to drive back there to see if I could maybe find any tracks or evidence of its existence. This thing, it was unlike anything I'd ever known. I didn't sleep that night, and when I did, they were filled with nightmares of this thing. Someday, I think I will go back there, see if it maybe is still around. I'm normally a very big skeptic, and I do not believe in ghosts or paranormal. I was even a police officer for a time, and truly felt like this thing was a potential danger had it been closer. But to know that it was circling around the woods to get to me without me ever realizing, like it was trying to purposefully be sneaky to sneak up on me, it makes me shudder. I'm confident that this was no person in a costume. I'm not sure what it was, but whatever it was, I was just thinking, if I don't run, I'm not going to survive. I truly believe this was something from the deep woods. Also, if this was a person in a costume, I see no reason why they would have acted the way they did. I'm not going to tell anybody else except you about this experience. I don't know what it is. I don't want to be the first person to give this thing a name or to know that there's more of these things out there. I just hope it never comes back looking for me. I think whatever it is still out there and is probably still roaming the woods somewhere. If you or someone you know has their own scary story, scary encounter, or a story you would like to share with me, please submit it to stories@whatlurksbeneath.com. I would love to hear from you.